At 32, Andrew's life seemed like it was falling apart. A failed marriage, battles with addiction, and a spiraling mental health crisis had left him broken. But when a simple MRI scan revealed a benign brain tumor, everything he thought he knew about himself and his past began to unravel. Was it too late to fix what was broken? This is Andrew's journey through love, loss, and the unexpected revelation that changed everything. At 32, Andrew found himself at a crossroads, reflecting on a life that had seemed so full of promise and potential, now left in tatters. His career as a marketing executive had once been a source of pride, but now it felt hollow. What hurt more than his professional decline was the emotional wreckage left by his failed marriage to Sarah. Looking back, he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment things began to unravel, but it was undeniable that everything had changed. His mental health had deteriorated in ways he couldn't control, and his relationship with Sarah, the woman he once loved with all his heart, had become a casualty of his own internal war. Andrew often questioned how it all spiraled so quickly. He had been the man who once dreamed of building a future with Sarah, imagining a life filled with shared dreams, adventures, and growing old together. But somewhere, he had lost himself. The paranoia, the anxiety, and the erratic behavior became impossible to ignore. He had tried to push through it, believing he could overcome the mental chaos on his own. But the weight of it all was too much. It impacted his ability to connect with those he loved, especially Sarah, who had once been his anchor. As Andrew sat in front of the camera, recounting his story, he shared how those golden days of love seemed so far away now. His mind had betrayed him, and with it, the life he once shared with Sarah. "I didn't understand what was happening to me," he admitted. "But now, looking back, I realize I wasn't just losing my marriage, I was losing myself." His voice trembled with the rawness of the emotion that still clung to him, despite everything that had happened. This video wasn't just about telling his story, it was about understanding it. How had everything gone so wrong? And could he ever find peace, both with himself and with the people he had hurt along the way? Before the spiral into chaos, there was a time when Andrew and Sarah's relationship was the stuff of dreams. Their love was effortless, the kind that felt destined to last forever. They shared everything: hopes, fears, passions, and most of all, the belief that they were invincible. Every date felt like an adventure, every conversation like a revelation. Andrew vividly remembers their first vacation together, a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the mountains. They spent their days hiking and their nights talking about everything and nothing. It was during those quiet moments that Andrew felt his love for Sarah deepen, solidifying the belief that they were meant to be. Their bond seemed unshakable. They'd been through so much together: laughter, tears, challenges, and had always come out stronger. But the moment Andrew proposed to Sarah, on a breathtaking evening amidst the ancient ruins of the Mayan temples, felt like the pinnacle of their love story. As the sun set over the jungle, Andrew knelt down, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she accepted his proposal, and in that moment, everything felt perfect. The future seemed full of possibilities. Their love was pure, untainted by the complexities that would soon emerge. But as Andrew looked back on that moment now, it felt almost like a different life. The love they shared seemed so far away, obscured by the fog of mental illness, addiction, and emotional distance. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened to that couple who believed they could conquer anything. How had they become strangers, drifting apart with each passing day? The love they once had felt unreachable now, locked away in memories that only served to deepen the ache of loss. For Andrew, it was a painful reminder of what he had lost, and what he couldn't seem to regain. It's strange how a single moment can define the trajectory of your entire life. For Andrew, that moment came in the midst of an ancient wonder, the Mayan ruins. He had planned it for months, wanting to mark their relationship with something unforgettable. Sarah had always dreamed of traveling, of exploring new places, and Andrew knew that the Mayan ruins would be the perfect setting for the question that had been on his mind for so long: will you marry me? Standing at the base of a grand pyramid, with the sun dipping below the horizon, Andrew couldn't have imagined a more perfect scene. The air was warm, the jungle alive with distant sounds, and Sarah, glowing with the light of the setting sun, looked like she had stepped out of a dream. As he dropped to one knee and asked Sarah to marry him, time seemed to stand still, her eyes filled with tears, and in that split second, the future stretched out before them, full of promise and love. Yes, Sarah whispered, and Andrew knew in that moment that their love was real, that their commitment to each other was unshakable. That night, they celebrated under a starlit sky, their hearts full of hope for what was to come. For Andrew, the proposal marked the peak of their relationship. They were invincible together. It was the beginning of what he had hoped would be a lifelong partnership. But as he reflects on that moment now, he can't help but wonder how quickly everything changed. The love they shared that night felt like it belonged to a different person, someone more innocent, less burdened by the weight of mental illness and emotional pain. The darkness that was lurking in his mind, which would later unravel their lives, was still hidden in the shadows. What he couldn't know then was that their golden days were numbered, and that the distance between them would grow in ways he never imagined. Andrew had once believed in the power of love, in the strength of commitment. But life, as it often does, took a turn he couldn't control. His mental health began to deteriorate, and with it, his relationship with Sarah. In hindsight, the proposal now seemed like a beautiful but fleeting moment in time, overshadowed by what was to come. The ruins, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a reminder of a lost future, a future he couldn't reclaim. But even with everything that had happened, Andrew held on to that memory, trying to piece together the fragments of a love that had slipped through his fingers. The first signs that something was wrong with Andrew weren't dramatic. They crept in slowly, like a fog that thickened over time. He couldn't sleep properly, his thoughts racing through his mind like a freight train, and the anxiety began to take over. Small things that never used to bother him became monumental. Every glance from a stranger felt like judgment. Every quiet moment was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. At first, he shrugged it off, telling himself it was just stress from work or the pressures of life. But as the days turned into weeks, Andrew's mind began to betray him in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't long before the paranoia set in. He began to believe that people were out to get him, that his friends and family were secretly plotting against him. It wasn't just a passing thought, these feelings were all-consuming. He'd lie awake at night, convinced that someone was watching him or listening to his every word. The voices in his head grew louder, and soon it became impossible to tell where reality ended and his mind began. He felt trapped inside a nightmare, unable to escape. One night, Sarah came home to find him pacing the living room, muttering to himself. His eyes were wide with fear, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He looked at her, his face pale, and said, "They're going to take everything from us. You have to believe me." It was in that moment that Sarah knew things had gone too far. She couldn't recognize the man standing before her. This wasn't the Andrew she married, the one who once held her hand and promised to protect her from the world. Desperate, Sarah rushed him to the emergency room, where a team of doctors took over. Andrew had been experiencing severe psychotic breaks, and it was clear that his mind was no longer functioning the way it once had. The diagnosis came a few days later: bipolar disorder, compounded by psychosis. It was a blow that shattered Andrew's already fragile sense of self. The revelation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Andrew finally had an explanation for the erratic thoughts and behaviors that had plagued him for so long. It made sense, in a way. But on the other hand, the diagnosis only made things more complicated. Bipolar disorder wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. And as Andrew would soon learn, it would affect not only his mind but every aspect of his life, including his marriage. As he sat in the sterile hospital room, his mind racing with the implications of his diagnosis, Andrew couldn't help but wonder how much of his relationship with Sarah had been shaped by this illness. Could he have saved their marriage if he had known sooner? Or was this just the beginning of the end, a result of something beyond his control? The weight of those questions hung over him as he tried to grasp the reality of his situation. It was clear that this diagnosis would be a turning point, but how far had he already fallen? The hardest thing Andrew ever had to hear wasn't a diagnosis, or the harsh words of a stranger. It was the quiet finality in Sarah's voice when she told him she wanted a divorce. Their relationship had already been strained by Andrew's mental health crisis, but up until that point, he had held on to the hope that they could work through it together. He still believed in their love, in the vows they had made, and in the promise of better days ahead. But Sarah's words shattered that hope in an instant. It was late at night, the weight of the world hanging heavy between them. They were sitting in their living room, the silence stretching on longer than it ever had before. Sarah had been distant for weeks, but Andrew still tried to convince himself it was just the stress of everything they were facing. Then, Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness, but also a quiet resolve. "I can't do this anymore, Andrew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't live in this chaos with you. I'm scared of you, and I can't keep pretending that everything is okay." Her words felt like a punch to his gut. Andrew couldn't find the strength to speak. How had it come to this? How had the woman he once shared his dreams with become someone who was afraid of him? In his heart, he knew the illness had been a silent thief, stealing parts of himself he couldn't even recognize. But the truth was harder to bear than any diagnosis. Sarah went on, explaining that she couldn't continue living in a relationship where she felt unsafe, unsure of what version of Andrew she was going to get each day. His paranoia, the emotional instability, and the unpredictable behavior had taken a toll on their connection, leaving her feeling isolated and overwhelmed. She loved him, but she couldn't sacrifice her own mental and emotional health for a marriage that had become nothing more than a constant battle. Andrew didn't fight her. In that moment, he couldn't. Part of him understood, even though it felt like his heart was being ripped from his chest. He realized he had failed her not intentionally, but through his illness he had driven them apart in ways he couldn't undo. As Sarah left the room that night, Andrew's world felt like it had crumbled completely. He was left alone in a space that no longer felt like home, haunted by the thought that perhaps his condition had cost him everything that mattered. After Sarah left, Andrew spiraled further into the abyss. He was consumed by guilt and grief, unable to escape the overwhelming sense of failure that weighed on him. His addiction to alcohol and prescription pills, which had always been a coping mechanism, worsened as he tried to numb the pain of losing Sarah. His days blurred together in a haze of substances, and the paranoia and anxiety grew worse. He knew he was sinking, but he didn't know how to swim back to shore. It was during one of the darkest nights of his life that Andrew realized something had to change. He couldn't keep going like this. His marriage was over, but he still had his life to live. He had to find a way to reclaim control. He checked into rehab, not just because he had to, but because he wanted to. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth: he was an addict, and he needed help. The rehab center was a place of isolation and reflection, a far cry from the chaotic life he had left behind. At first, it felt like a prison, a place where he had no control, surrounded by strangers who seemed to have their own demons to face. But as the days turned into weeks, Andrew began to realize that this was exactly what he needed. The structure, the therapy, the support, it all provided a foundation for him to confront the parts of himself he had been running from for years. The hardest part was facing the reality of how much he had lost. Each therapy session forced him to look at his past, at the mistakes he had made, and at the person he had become. But slowly, Andrew began to rebuild himself, brick by brick. He started to recognize the patterns in his behavior, the triggers that led to his breakdowns, and the ways his mental illness had clouded his judgment. With time, he gained clarity that would later help him understand why he and Sarah had drifted apart. Yet even in rehab, the pain of his divorce lingered. Every day was a struggle to forgive himself, to heal the parts of him that had been shattered. But Andrew also began to realize that true recovery wasn't just about healing his body or his mind, it was about learning to love himself again. He wasn't the man he had been when he and Sarah first met, but that didn't mean he couldn't become someone better, someone whole. The road was long, and there were no guarantees, but Andrew was determined to fight for his life. After months of recovery and therapy, Andrew's life began to feel more stable. But as part of his ongoing treatment, his doctor ordered a routine MRI to monitor his mental health progress. Andrew had gotten used to the long list of tests, appointments, and medical procedures. The physical toll of his addiction had been significant, but he was more focused on his mental state, which had dominated his life for so long. He didn't think much of the MRI. It was just another checkup until it wasn't. The call came one evening, while Andrew was sitting at his kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside him. His mind was still consumed by the slow process of healing, trying to piece together the wreckage of his past. When the doctor's voice came over the phone, it was calm but serious. "Andrew, we've found something. A benign tumor in your brain." For a moment, he couldn't process what he was hearing. Tumor? His mind raced to every worst-case scenario he'd ever heard. But the doctor continued, explaining that the tumor was benign, meaning it wasn't cancerous. Yet the tumor's location in his brain explained many of the chaotic thoughts, paranoia, and erratic behavior that had shaped his life. It was like a missing piece of a puzzle falling into place. The way his emotions had swung violently, how his thoughts had spiraled out of control, it all started to make sense. Andrew sat in stunned silence as the doctor outlined the next steps, how the tumor would be monitored, and how it might be contributing to his bipolar disorder symptoms. But the emotional weight of the moment was heavy. For years, he had been blaming himself, thinking he was weak, that he couldn't control his mind, or that he wasn't trying hard enough. The diagnosis shifted everything. It wasn't all in his head, literally. The tumor had been an unwelcome, hidden culprit. It had been quietly shaping his behavior, and yet, until now, no one had considered it as a factor. As Andrew absorbed the news, he felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief because he now had an explanation, something tangible to point to that could account for the chaos that had consumed his life. But guilt, too, for not having known sooner. Could he have saved his marriage if he had been aware of the tumor earlier? Would Sarah still be with him if the doctors had discovered this earlier? These questions lingered, unresolved, haunting him with regret. But the diagnosis was also a turning point. It gave him a new sense of purpose, a clearer path forward. He wasn't just fighting an illness of the mind, he was fighting a physical condition that had been affecting him in ways he hadn't understood. The road to healing was still long, but now there was hope. And with that hope came the realization that his life, though altered forever, wasn't completely lost. There was still time to rebuild. As Andrew sat in the quiet solitude of his apartment, the weight of his diagnosis began to settle in. The benign brain tumor had given him an answer, a reason for the years of mental anguish, but it also brought a flood of painful realizations. The years of spiraling, of losing control, had left scars that would never fully heal. His relationship with Sarah was irreparable, and no amount of reflection could change the fact that she was no longer in his life. He couldn't stop thinking about the what-ifs. What if he had known about the tumor sooner? What if he had recognized the signs of his mental health decline before it destroyed everything? Would he still be married to Sarah if he had sought treatment earlier? These questions swirled in his mind like an endless loop, feeding his regret and self-blame. He realized that the love they had shared, the life they had built together, was gone, and no amount of what-ifs could bring it back. Yet, despite the sorrow, there was something else that Andrew began to feel a shift. He wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point, the guilt that had consumed him began to fade into acceptance. He had to come to terms with the fact that the path they had walked together was no longer theirs to continue. His illness had played a significant role in the breakdown of their relationship, but it wasn't the only factor. There were times when he could have done better, been more present, or more communicative. But he couldn't change the past. What mattered now was how he moved forward. Through therapy and self-reflection, Andrew began to understand that his journey wasn't just about recovering from addiction or healing from a mental health crisis. It was about accepting who he had become and who he was still capable of being. The idea of reconnecting with Sarah or trying to repair their marriage became less appealing over time. It wasn't that he didn't love her, it was that he had learned that love wasn't enough to fix what was broken. The relationship had reached its end, and holding on to it would only hinder his growth. The most difficult step, however, was reconciling with himself. He had spent so much time blaming himself, hating the person he had become, but now he began to see that he could heal in his own way. He was not defined by the mistakes he had made or the things that had been out of his control. He was defined by his ability to rise from the ashes, to rebuild his life piece by piece, even if that meant leaving behind parts of himself that no longer served him. In the end, Andrew realized that acceptance was the key to moving forward. He didn't need to know how things would turn out or whether he could ever be the person he once was. What mattered was that he was still standing, and that, in itself, was enough. As Andrew's healing journey continued, the question of reconnecting with Sarah loomed heavily over him. Friends and family often encouraged him to reach out, to see if their shared history and the new understanding of his condition could lead to closure, or even reconciliation. For weeks, Andrew wrestled with this idea, replaying moments of their past in his mind. He remembered the way she used to look at him with unwavering love and the laughter they shared during their happiest days. But he also couldn't forget the pain in her voice the day she told him she wanted a divorce. He thought about picking up the phone countless times, even drafting messages he never sent. Each time, though, he stopped himself. Deep down, he realized that reaching out wasn't about healing, it was about holding on to the past. Andrew understood that their relationship had been a casualty of circumstances beyond their control, but trying to rekindle what was lost would only reopen old wounds. Sarah had moved on, and now, so had he. The decision not to reconnect wasn't easy. It required immense strength to let go of the hope that had carried him through his darkest days. But Andrew came to see that his healing didn't depend on Sarah's forgiveness or their reunion. It depended on his ability to forgive himself and accept that some chapters of life are meant to remain closed. This choice marked a turning point for Andrew. By choosing to focus on his own growth rather than seeking external validation, he felt a sense of liberation. The love he had for Sarah would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined who he was. For the first time in years, he was free. As Andrew sat in his small, cozy apartment one rainy evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the depths of despair to the slow, painstaking climb toward recovery, every step had shaped him into a stronger, more self-aware person. His diagnosis had been a revelation, his struggles a crucible, and his healing a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Andrew knew his story wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. There were no magical reconciliations or instant fixes. But what he had found was something far more valuable: peace. He had come to terms with his past, embraced his imperfections, and found hope in the possibility of a brighter future. Through therapy, he had rediscovered the joy in simple things: a morning walk, a good book, or a heartfelt conversation with a friend. He began to nurture relationships with those who supported him unconditionally and found comfort in the knowledge that his experiences could inspire others to seek help and never give up. Andrew's story is one of transformation, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is a spark of light waiting to be uncovered. While his journey continues, he faces the future with gratitude for the lessons learned and hope for the days ahead. Thank you for watching Andrew's story. If it touched your heart or inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience and healing. Together, we can make a difference.